Ivan Zaitsev on the results of tracking Steppe Eagles in Daurian, the Russian-Chinese border, the most eastern region of discussing today.
Так, меня слышно? Хорошо? Хорошо. Меня зовут...
Okay, hope everything is audible. My name is Zaitsev. I represent the Daur Reserve. It is very difficult to speak after Igor because our topics are similar, but we have much fewer data and we have to squeeze everything we can out of whatever we have. Well, back in 2019 and 2020, our ornithologists in the Russian part of Daur Steppes have tagged 10 juvenile steppe eagles on the nest. Out of 9 nests, there was one where we had 2 individuals tagged. And in 2022, our Chinese colleagues have tagged 1 steppe eagle. They have provided us the data. That was a juvenile steppe that was taken away, kind of extracted from the wild nature, and who was raised in rehabilitation center, who was taken care of in a rehabilitation center. And after that, he was released, and he began his migration right after the release. So all in all, we have received only one. We had only one full cycle of this Chinese steppe eagle, and only 4 autumn tracks of migration cycle from our Daur steppe eagles. So mortality rates are quite high. On the other hand, the trackers had their own difficulties that complicated obtaining the data. So I must start with the chronology, right? And from the very first tagging, putting the trackers on. So, since we installed the tracker, we started collecting the data. So we tagged them a little late. It was 27th of July. In August, I think it was a little late, really. We should have started sooner. So during the first week, we had the very first cluster of dots within the territory from 100 to 300 meters. During the first week, we had these flights, the first flights up to 1 or 2 kilometers, and by the second month, we had much more flights and migrations, going as far as 60 kilometers for one bird, at least. That was. And what is the interesting conclusion that we have arrived to when we began looking in greater detail? Apparently, it was very difficult to find the nest where it was tagged. Yes, we do have the tagged points for locations, but oftentimes after the tagging, right after the tagging, the steppe eagle just abandons the nest. It never comes back. It just flies away by 120 to 200 kilometers, and then we have this initial cluster. Where it stays for the first 20 days after the tagging. And inside, we had from 7 to 15 locations where the birds spend the night. So the yellow ones stand for red, one stands for active point, and blue one stands for night rest and sleep. Also, after the initial period of 20 days, when the birds spend this time within the cluster, they start the first flights. And you can see the new cluster. And actually, the birds fly between these clusters as well, and from this larger cluster to a smaller outer cluster, so it's small distances. Let's move on to auto migration. We have data from all of the birds at the beginning of migration, but not for all closer to the end of the migration. However, we can see that the beginning of migration starts sometime mid-September, and the latest response, the latest migration was mid-October. And as we can see, all the trackers are not functioning at the moment, regrettably. And the average date is the 3rd of October. That was the start of auto migration. So this is what our migration flyways look like, or tracks look like. Well, we have highlighted all of these different birds. What I can summarize here, conclude here, is that the migration corridor is rather narrow. Almost 90% of all the flyway they go through Birken Gan, there is Lost Plateau, then it goes through the eastern periphery of Tibetan Plateau. So it's interesting that the yellow line, where the one bird decided to cross the Tibetan Plateau and it ended up in the Himalaya. And the second bifurcation point is the border between border of China and Myanmar. Two birds decided to go to Nepal through Himalaya, and others continued their southwest flight and wintered in Myanmar. So here are the main parameters that we have measured for migration. Well, the average migration start date was the 6th of October and end was the 26th of November. What's interesting here that there's a big difference between the minimum and maximum values in the duration of migration from 40 to 74 days. Even for this Indo-Nepal group, these three birds had difference in duration of migration. The length of tracks was 575 kilometers, which is quite a long flyway for the predators that we measure, because we also have trackers on imperial eagles, on harriers. They don't go this far, but these are the longest we see. The migration speed varies as well from 75 to 134 days. This number 152 actually stayed for quite a while during migration. It had 56 stops, where the average number of stops for Myanmar flying birds was from 1 to 34. Well, between Myanmar and Nepal, there were some other additional stops, but it wasn't 20. I mean, the difference wasn't 20. There were quite a number of stops. For the rest of them, we unfortunately were not able to detect the number due to incomplete data. And the share of stops was more or less same. I mean, for both Myanmar group and Indo-Nepal group, from 80 to 84%. So here I show the spring migration. We had only one track, the blue one. Blue one stands for the autumn migration, the red one stands for spring. Apologies. Autumn migration stands for red, and blue stands for spring migration of same bird, one bird. To understand, you kind of to be able to compare this track. So location, it is more or less the same as the autumn one, but if we look at the length of the track, that is the 079, that has 5,600 kilometers, and in spring it had 4,500 kilometers, and the difference is 1,000 kilometers. And why is that? That has to do with the fact that during fall migration they have lots of rings, lots of kind of loops that the birds have to take. Yeah, I mean, if you look, I mean, I cannot enlarge, I cannot zoom in, but this would be, you would be able to see that. At the northern and eastern part of periphery of Tibetan Plateau, there was quite a big ring of about 600, 700 kilometers that the bird add to the oval trajectory. The beginning of spring migration starts on 22nd of March and it ends on the 18th of May. The migration duration was 52 days. Almost the same as fall migration, and the number of stops and the proportion of stops was very similar to that of the fall migration. We decided to look more carefully at the risks and the reasons for potential death and mortality of steppe eagles, especially at the wintering periods. Our Indian colleagues may have already talked about this on the first day of the conference. The biggest problem, especially until the ban was on diclofenac was put in place in India, was poisoning by diclofenac, by feeding off the carcasses of domestic animals. So we had inspected every plot, every spot during wintering, all the clusters that is wintering in Nepal, and we did not detect foraging off of landfills or places where carcasses are dumped. Why? This is central Nepal, Bukhara Valley, which is a very tourist-oriented, tourist-driven area of Nepal, even tourist mecca of Nepal. There is a huge number of hotels, mountain resorts, shrines, and pagodas. So there are different Hinduist and Buddhist shrines, and so the probability of having centralized carcass landfill is very low because it's not very attractive for the tourists. And I think during the wintering, our steppe eagles were neighbors to tourists, not to dead carcasses. We also checked other risks, such as high voltage power lines and pesticides. For pesticides, the probability is actually higher because we noticed or we detected that steppe eagles were feeding on terrace farms. You see quite well here in this forest that they would either aggregate on terrace farm, they would find forage, or maybe on the downhills, on the slopes, on the hills in the forest. Here we see a high aggregation of daytime rest and nighttime rest near the river and near the settlements, really close to the river, close to human habitats. So really orange ones and pink points, they stand for, these are Google points, indicating hotels and tourist attractions, tourist visitation place. The situation in Myanmar is a little different. The steppe eagles would mostly stay in the watershed, kind of in the floodplains around Irivat River. There were kind of agricultural fields with lots of culture. So here's the zoomed photo. What can we see here? Daytime sites are dispersed across the fields where they seem to hunt, but the nighttime rests are closer to the forest lines where the birds spend their night, sleep and recover. Well, as for the risks, I think the pesticide poisoning is particularly important for us, for our eagle steppes. Why is that? Because we have studied and surveyed the latest final stops of wintering as well as stops. And in 4 instances, these dots concentrate on the fields. It means agricultural fields. So the probability of pesticide poisoning is quite high because they might be eating rodents or something else. But in 2 cases, the birds died due to unknown reasons, but in the rest of the cases that had to do with the trackers. We lost the birds due to the trackers. Well, these are the data, maybe a little meager, unfortunately not as many as we wanted to receive, but nevertheless, it is still very informative, very useful, because this kind of study was done for the first time in Trans-Baikal area, and now we have at least some info about the flyways and migration routes for our Daur steppes, originating steppe eagles. Thank you.